At the Baltimore Science Museum, there's a kids' science show in which rats play basketball. The rims are lower and the ball's a lot smaller, of course, but the game is the same. The rats take the ball and work very hard to get it up and through the hoop. The educators at the museum invested a lot of time and energy into training the rats for this particular demonstration. They couldn't just explain to the rats how the game works. The behavior of the rats was gradually shaped based on a combination of classical and operant conditioning. In general, anytime the rats exhibited behaviors that were more similar to the game of basketball, they received a reward. The educators couldn't explain the game to them, but just using rewards, they could get the rats to engage in this very complicated behavior. While there are limits to what you can teach a rat to do, if you can define the target behaviors clearly, those limits are very high. In principle, we could do the same thing with our children. In this lecture, I'll discuss the science of shaping and molding the behaviors of children, how we can train children to do the things we would like them to do, and how we can train them to refrain from doing the things that we don't want them to do. Much of our thinking in this area is influenced by notions of reward and punishment. If the child does something good, give him a reward. If he behaves badly, then punish him. Straightforward stuff, right? Conditioning and behaviors are topics that psychologists usually study with rats, not children. My first tip for this lecture, however, is that you should not treat your child like a rat. Now, I know you almost certainly don't, but the human mind is predisposed, perhaps even pre-wired, to shape the behaviors of others the way an experimenter might shape the behavior of a rat. It's a tendency that's present in all humans, in all parents, even in all great courses professors. I'll explain why this is and present some studies that suggest a way to break those habits. I will argue that you should never hit your kids, no matter what. It just doesn't work, and there's some major side effects that come with corporal punishment. A lot of research backs this particular point up. I'll argue that you should catch your children being good and reward them for it. As you do this, you won't think that it's working. Your brain just isn't wired to be sensitive to it, but it will work. By keeping track of it, ideally in collaboration with your children, you can train them to do almost anything you want. Finally, I'll argue that you should explain things to children in detail, in even more detail than they can understand. Rats don't get anything out of an adult human explaining things to them, but even very young children do, even if they don't understand the vast majority of the details contained in that explanation. There's a fascinating study of 18 to 24-month-old children that I think about a lot. It was directly based on some studies conducted by a researcher named Ken Chang with rats. In Chang's study, he would take a very hungry rat and place it in a rectangular box. 2 of the walls were short and 2 of the walls were long. The room was completely symmetrical, which turns out to be important for this procedure. In each corner of the room was a small well where a food pellet could be placed and hidden, such that the rat could only see the food if it dug into it. The experimenter would hide some food, they were Cocoa Puffs actually, and the rat would be allowed to start to dig it up. As soon as it found the food, however, the rat would be lifted up, rotated around to disorient it, and then be placed in an exact replica of that first box. The rats would then look around, reorient themselves, and then start searching for those delicious Cocoa Puffs again. The question that Chang wanted to ask in this experiment was how well the rats could remember where the food was located, which corner of the room the rats would check first. He was also very interested in what information the rats could use to help with this process of getting reoriented to their environment. The results of the experiment were really clear. The rats searched in the correct location about half the time. The other half of the time, they searched in the opposite corner of the room. That is, they weren't random in where they searched. Indeed, they were quite systematic. If the food was hidden to the left of a short wall, then they would search in the 2 locations that were to the left of a short wall. The room was completely symmetrical, remember, so this was the best the rats could do. The next experiment followed the same procedure, But this time, the walls of the room were given distinctive colors and textures. One of the walls would be dark black, for instance, and smooth. Another would be bright white. Now, with these colors, there's enough information for the rats to be perfect. If you were in this study, you as a human adult, you would be perfect. You would remember, for instance, that the food was to the left of a short white wall, and there would only be one location in the room that matched that description. Only one problem: the rats were not perfect. In fact, they were essentially no better than when the room was completely symmetrical and all the walls had the same color. Now, you might be thinking that perhaps the rats couldn't see the coloring on the wall. Maybe rats are just colorblind, but you'd be wrong. If the same coloring were used to train the rats on a different task, maybe to press a bar, for instance, push the bar with the white coloring behind it and you'll get a reward. If it were a bar pressing task, then the rats could use the coloring just fine. The rats, for some reason, cannot use coloring information when they navigate around the world. When a rat reorients itself, when it figures out where it's located within its environment, it's very good at using geometric spatial information. It's seemingly colorblind, however, when it performs this process. It's as if there's some module within the brain of the rat that's responsible for spatial orientation, and that module just isn't connected to the parts of the brain that are responsible for encoding colors. Linda Hermer and Elizabeth Spelke at Cornell University at the time wondered if maybe the human brain had this same type of modular organization. They adapted Chang's rat procedure to work with kids about 1.5 and 2 years of age. The kids would walk into a rectangular room with 2 short walls and 2 long walls. It was bigger, of course, than the rat room. All of these walls were colored white, and the room was constructed to be completely symmetrical. In each corner, there was a hiding place where a toy could be placed. The child watched the experimenter hide the toy, and then the child was disoriented. A parent would pick them up, cover their eyes, and spin around 3 times. The child wouldn't be dizzy, but when the child was set down in a random orientation in the middle of the room, he or she would have to figure out where the toy was based on memory. As I mentioned with the rats, when the room was completely symmetrical, there's no way to be perfect. The best you can do is to be about 50% correct. And 1.5 and 2-year-olds are just that. They don't search randomly. They search almost all the time in the 2 spots that are opposite one another, the one with the toy and the one in the opposite corner. The really interesting thing happens when you make one of the walls of the room blue and then repeat the procedure with another group of kids this time. If you do the procedure with adults, they're essentially perfect. Same with 2-year-olds, but not the 1.5-year-olds. Even if you point out that blue wall to them at the start of the procedure, they're still only about 50% correct in their searches. It's as if the kids can't use color information for this particular task. The one-line summary of the result often gets a laugh when it's presented at conferences. 18-month-olds are just like rats. In this case, they are. Something happens between 18 and 24 months that frees children from this rat-like state. I'll tell you what that is in a little while, but for the moment, I want to convince you that 18-month-old toddlers, while they are in this situation, are not like rats. I promised to come back to the toddlers in that rat room study at the end, but let me wind the clock back to the 1950s and the second most cited psychological scientists in history, B.F. Skinner. Skinner was the undisputed champion of a school of thought called behaviorism. There's actually a lot of detail that goes with these ideas, but the real pillar of it is the idea that we all learn based on the reinforcement and punishment histories that we collect as we go through life. All of us, rats and humans alike. According to Skinner, there are 4 main types of results that an experiment or the real world can give you: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. Positive reinforcement is the easiest to conceive. If you engage in some behavior and afterwards there's an increased probability of experiencing something positive, then you will increase the likelihood of performing that behavior in the future. That's a long and complex way of saying something very simple. If you do something and get a reward, you'll likely do it more in the future, right? Negative reinforcement is often confused with the notion of punishment, but it's not the same thing. Negative reinforcement is the reduction of something bad. Imagine that every time I come home from school late, my mother yells at me. If I hurry home, I may find that the likelihood of this yelling is reduced. The negative change in the aversive stimulus, in this case the yelling, is reinforcing. I'll be more likely to hurry home in the future. Positive punishment is the increase in the frequency of some aversive stimulus. If I fight with my sister at the table, I get yelled at. This increase in yelling is something I want to avoid, so I'll reduce my fighting with my sister behavior. Negative punishment, then, is the last of these four options. Maybe I get a cookie every day when I get home from school. If I throw my coat on the floor, maybe I don't get my cookie. This negative change in the frequency of a positive event, that is, getting cookies in this case, that will make it less likely that I'll throw my coat on the floor in the future. These principles work. The two reinforcers, either positive or negative, result in increasing the likelihood of some behavior. The two types of punishment, either positive or negative, reduce the frequency of some behavior. Just go to SeaWorld or any animal stage show, or even the Baltimore Science Museum, and you'll see the amazing sets of behaviors that animals can be trained to do. These principles work with people too. There's an old story about a psychology professor who taught, among other things, the principles of operant conditioning. This idea that you can shape behaviors based on automatic, unconscious reinforcement mechanisms. The students learned what he was teaching perhaps a little too well and decided to have some fun with it. They talked amongst themselves, outside the class, and made a deal that whenever he was on the left side of the stage, where he lectured, they would perk up. They'd take notes, they'd raise their hands, they'd be enthusiastic when asked a question. They would basically be model, ideal students. Whenever the professor happened to wander over to the right side of the stage, they would still listen, but they'd stop taking notes. They'd look down, they'd not raise their hands, and basically act as much as possible like a sleepy, uninterested class, as they possibly could. Within a single lecture, the professor was beginning to avoid the right side of the stage and lecture from the left. Within a couple of lectures, he was spending all of his time over on the left. By the end of the semester, according to the story, the students halted this entertaining game because the professor kept falling off of the left side of the stage, and they were worried he was going to get hurt. And this was a professor who knew all about these principles. If you pick some behavior that you want your child to do, and you consistently apply these principles, that behavior will increase in frequency. It works. In this regard, children really are just like rats, except they aren't. One of the central tenets of Skinner's theories of behaviorism is the concept of equipotentiality, the idea that all stimuli, behaviors, and reinforcers are equally likely to be linked. It's all just a matter of which links, which associations, happen to have been related by selective reinforcement. Part of this idea suggests that it doesn't matter whether you choose to reinforce a good behavior or punish the opposite bad behavior. If you want the child to stop fighting with her brother, should you reward her when she makes it through an hour without fighting, or punish her when she doesn't, or both? The original behaviorist theory suggests that you should do whichever is most convenient. But there have been dozens of studies now that suggest that this is simply not true, and certainly not with humans. If you punish a child, especially if the punishment involves physical, corporal punishment like spanking, the child will learn to avoid engaging in the behavior that sparked the punishment event. But the child will learn much more than that. First, the child learns to avoid engaging in the behavior specifically when the punishing parent is present. If you aren't around to punish the bad behavior, like the fighting with the brother, then the child knows full well that spanking is unlikely, and so the frequency of fighting will not be affected at all. The second thing that the child learns is a higher level cognitive concept. The child learns a strategy. The child learns that if someone does something that you don't like them doing, then the response is violence. Kids who are hit at home, even infrequently, are significantly more likely to hit their peers at school. Children imitate their parents all the time. You can never tell a young child to do as I say, not as I do. You can tell them, but they won't typically do it. Parents are role models, not just in how they interact with other adults, but especially in how they interact with the children themselves. And there are consequences that come with a child who's violent with his peers at school. There are, of course, the calls from the teachers and school administrators. The child might learn to think of himself, though, as a bad kid and be more likely to get into trouble in the future. A child with a reputation for violence might carry that into the rest of that year and even the next grade. A more subtle, but probably more important reaction to a violent child often comes not from the adults, not from the teachers, but from the other children. Kids who hit, or more likely kids who are shunned by their peers. Their social standing can be tremendously damaged by repeated acts of violence. Who wants to play with a kid who might haul off and hit you? So there's a broad consensus among developmental scientists and pediatricians and teachers that any potential benefits of spanking are greatly outweighed by the potential negatives that I've discussed here. But this is, of course, about science, not just about advice, so I have to add a caveat in here. If you search the web or a good database of parenting science articles, you'll see that there's an active debate that continues about corporal punishment. I've told the case for the anti-spanking side here because I believe that's the most soundly reasoned and, frankly, the best supported by the available evidence. That said, there's an inherent confound in many of the studies that we've considered here: individual differences. We've discussed corporal punishment as something that's completely up to the parents, a choice that the parents make one way or the other. It's, of course, up to any parent whether they spank or not, but the child, with his or her behavior, contributes to that decision. If a child is especially bad at regulating behavior or very strong-willed and defiant, then there's a greater likelihood that corporal punishment will be administered with that particular child. The use of corporal punishment has been linked to a wide range of negative outcomes, but what I'm describing here is the way in which it might not be the spanking that leads to those negative outcomes. Maybe children who are especially bad at regulating behavior or very strong-willed and defiant are more likely to experience negative outcomes later. Maybe the spanking is completely epiphenomenal. It's just another outcome caused by some other underlying cause. Perhaps the best argument from this intellectual camp is that just as spanking is related to many negative outcomes, so is psychotherapy. So is the frequency of being grounded as a punishment. Kids who have behavioral problems tend to end up in therapy far more often than kids who do not. But no one would seriously argue that therapy results in developmental problems, not many people anyway. Most people would accept that there was an underlying problem that's related to negative outcomes, and the psychotherapy is used to deal with that, not that the therapy caused the problem. The existence of these relationships suggests that the reasoning based on individual differences, independent of spanking, is important. Some kids are just more challenging than others from a parenting perspective. So there's no evidence that corporal punishment is bad for children's development and their relationships with their families and peers. That's not true. A range of studies have worked around this individual differences confound by using longitudinal methods. These are studies in which you follow individuals over time to see how they develop as a function of, and if and when, corporal punishment is administered. Think again for a moment about the link between psychotherapy and negative developmental outcomes. There's an underlying problem that may be linked to both, the problem that led to parents to seek therapy for their child in the first place. If the therapy is the thing that caused the problem, then as the therapy continues, the problem should get worse. It doesn't. More psychotherapy is consistently associated with reductions in the associated problems, not increases. The same can't be said for corporal punishment. Over time, the children with more experiences with corporal punishment tend to increase in terms of the negative antisocial outcomes I've described here. There's good evidence that corporal punishment leads to developmental problems. Not every kid, every time, but on average, the effects are there. Not all researchers are completely convinced of this, but the vast majority are. I certainly am. I hope that you are too. No one wakes up in the morning thinking, "Good morning, world. I hope I spank my kids today." But kids can really get parents angry sometimes. In those moments, it might be worth thinking about this, about all this research, and probably counting to 10. Perhaps the best reason not to use corporal punishment, however, is that it doesn't work. Not like most people think it does anyway. If you really want to shape the behavior of children, there are two things you need to do on a consistent basis. First, you should use positive reinforcement, probably more than you will if you don't focus on it. Second, you should explain why you want your kids to behave in a certain way, even to the extent that it goes beyond their understanding. The first tip there, to use positive reinforcement, is very Skinnerian, very behaviorist. You should positively reinforce your kids for good behavior so that they will engage in good behavior more frequently. This might sound obvious, but it can be a surprisingly challenging thing to do. The events that capture our attention and our concern as parents when we're watching our kids are typically negative ones. If my daughter misbehaves, especially if it's a type of misbehavior that's been frequent and ongoing despite my many attempts to stop it, that's very salient. Getting my attention focused on that just isn't a problem. If she fails to take her dishes to the kitchen at the end of dinner, again, I'll certainly notice that. If the positive event is happening, say my kids are playing nicely and not fighting, as often as not, I might not even notice. I might notice from time to time, I'll see them playing and have a nice thought. Oh, look at those two, they're so sweet and wonderful. They are, by the way. But most people are unlikely to say anything in that situation. There's no behavior to shape. So why take a chance of breaking the spell of the nice play that's already happening all by itself? The problem, of course, is that there is behavior to shape. This is exactly the time when you can do the most good to reduce the frequency of the bad behaviors. This good time is just the time when you need to positively reinforce your kids for doing what you want them to do. It can be as simple as talking with your kids at that moment. Hey, you two are playing really nicely together. You're doing a really good job of that. Isn't this nice? Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Especially with younger kids, if the targeted activity is very specific, sometimes a sticker-based system can be really good. We use this for our kids so that we wouldn't have to argue with them about going to bed each night. We had each of them write their names at the top of a large index card and decorate it with crayons and markers. Then we talked to them individually and together about this new game we were going to play. There's a new deal we were going to make with them. Every night, Jackie, my daughter's Jackie in this case, every night when I tell you it's time to get ready for bed, you've had a problem listening. It's always a big to-do to get everyone upstairs and bathed and into pajamas. It's not the end of the world or anything, but sometimes it makes Mommy and Daddy sad. Bedtime should be a fun, happy time that we spend together talking, reading, having quiet fun. If you don't listen, then we lose that, and it's not so nice. That's why I'm hoping we can figure out a way to make it better. Here's a game we're going to start playing tonight, and I think it'll do just that. Every night I would say to my daughter, if you're really super good about listening and getting ready for bed, then in the morning you get 2 stickers to put on your card. If you're so-so about listening at bedtime, then you get 1 sticker. And if you're not very nice at all, then 0 stickers. When you get 10 stickers on your card, then we go get you a new toy. The change in behavior here was almost instant. In fact, as I'll describe in a minute, it's actually a mistake to really say this is positive reinforcement at work here at all. The kids would listen. When little conflicts would come up, they would quickly want to know, is that going to affect my sticker? I still get a sticker tomorrow, right? In the morning, one of the first things they would want to do is get those stickers and put them on their cards. The toys we bought, about 1 per week, maybe 1 every other week, they were small. The dollar store was the typical recipient of our business on those days. It was some of the best money we ever spent. It's easy, I think, to imagine how you could adapt this sticker game to almost any situation, almost any behavior where you'd like to see a lasting change. There are 2 keys to this. One I've already described. You want to reinforce the positive. Encourage the kids to do the behaviors you want them to do, not punish them for doing the behaviors you don't want them to do. The second thing you want to be sure to do here to maximize the change is to explain to the child what you're thinking, why you want them to change their pattern of behavior. Humans in general are much more willing to change their behaviors if you can give them a reason for making that change. Indeed, in the absence of a good explanation, most people, adults or children, can be really stubborn about changing. This is especially true with kids. If you can make that clear connection with your child, even if the kid doesn't completely understand it, your actions are more likely to have an impact, and much more likely to have a lasting impact that extends, we hope, beyond the end of that sticker game that you set up. That was our experience with bedtime, by the way. The bedtime sticker game was really compelling for a few weeks, but at some point we just kind of forgot about it, the kids as well as the parents. A few months later, behaviors got a little bad for a while, so we revived the game for a week or so, but then it faded away again. It's as if the stickers weren't the real reward here at all, not the toys either. Maybe at first they were, but I think the kids like to have a nice time talking, reading, playing quietly at bedtime, just as much as the parents. The sticker game wasn't really positive reinforcement per se, not at all. It was, as much as anything, a good way to get the kids' attention and a good way to communicate with them, just like the explanation was a direct verbal communication about how to live well. Positive reinforcement isn't really at work here in any direct way. Human children are not like rats. They're subject to influence and reinforcement and punishment, but they are, like adults, far more influenced by their own thinking, their own communication, their own decisions. If we interact with kids at that level, we're much more likely to connect. I started this lecture talking about how human toddlers are like rats in terms of their spatial reasoning. Just like rats, the kids seemed unable to use color, even colors they could see very easily, as a clue to where to find a hidden object. Well, they were like rats when considered as a group, but a follow-up analysis revealed something really interesting. On average, the toddlers were terrible at using colors, but a few of the kids succeeded, right from the start and on almost every test trial. When the parents visited the lab for this experiment, the researchers happened to have them fill out a questionnaire about their child's developmental progress up to that point. When did the child first walk? Were there any developmental delays identified by the family pediatrician, etc.? One part of that survey was about what words the parent believed the child could understand and what words the child occasionally used on their own. The best predictor of whether a child will succeed in using color in that rectangular room experiment isn't how old she is. The best predictor is whether the child understands words like to the left and to the right. If the parent checked those boxes on the form, then their child was very likely to find the hidden toy, more than 50% of the time. I think the reason is obvious here. If you know those terms, then when the toy is hidden in the corner, you can engage in a little private speech with yourself. Okay, self, remember the toy is to the right of the short blue wall. Once you've encoded the information verbally in that fashion, then you can be disoriented all day long. You can leave the room entirely and come back. When you open your eyes and look around that room again, the location of the toy will be completely apparent. Humans have language. We engage in high-level reasoning in a way that, as far as we can tell, most all other animals do not. To some extent, non-human primates like chimpanzees do, but even there, things are really different. Certainly rats don't think in symbolic word-based terms. Human children, however, very much do. The sooner we begin engaging them as humans and not rats, the better things are for everyone in the family.